Prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the unknown as we delve into 7 spine-tingling Wendigo encounters that will haunt your dreams. Join us as we explore these terrifying tales, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more bone-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.
Imagine driving down a dark, deserted road in the dead of night. Your headlights slice through the blackness, revealing nothing but twisted trees and the occasional glint of something unsettling. You feel a shiver crawl up your spine because, deep down, you know you're not alone. Now buckle up, because this is not just any road. This is the Lost Highway, and once you enter, you might never come back. Welcome to the ride of your nightmares. Jake had always been a bit of a thrill seeker, so when he heard about the Lost Highway, he knew he had to check it out. It wasn't exactly on the map, kind of like a local legend for adrenaline junkies and ghost hunters. So one chilly October night, armed with nothing but a full tank of gas and a pack of beef jerky, he set out to conquer his curiosity. The road stretched out before him like a dark ribbon, seemingly endless. Jake's headlights cast eerie shadows that danced and flickered along the edge of the road, making the forest feel alive. The only sounds were the hum of his engine and the occasional snap of branches in the breeze. The air was thick with anticipation, or maybe it was just the cold. "Piece of cake," Jake muttered to himself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Just a long, boring road. Nothing to it. But as he drove further, things started to get weird. The temperature dropped rapidly, and his breath misted up the windshield. His radio, which had been playing static since he started, suddenly crackled to life. A voice, low, distorted, spoke just a single word: "Leave." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Okay, not cool," he said, his voice wavering. He glanced at his phone. No signal. Perfect. Just the kind of situation you want when you're miles from civilization. He pressed on, trying to brush off the voice as a glitch or interference. But then he saw something in the road ahead, a figure standing motionless. Jake slowed down, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, ragged and disheveled, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "Hey!" Jake shouted, but the figure didn't move. He stopped the car and rolled down his window. "Need some help?" The man's lips barely moved, but Jake could hear him. "Turn back!" Jake's gut twisted. Something was off, but he wasn't the type to back down. "I'm good. Thanks." As he rolled up the window, the man slowly stepped aside, revealing a crumpled, hand-drawn map on the ground. Jake's curiosity got the better of him. He pulled over and picked it up. The map was crude, with red lines marking a series of twists and turns that didn't correspond with anything on a normal map. With a mix of excitement and dread, Jake continued down the road, now following the map's directions. The road seemed to warp and twist unnaturally, and every turn felt like he was driving into an ever-deepening abyss. Then the car started to sputter. "Seriously?" Jake groaned, glancing at the fuel gauge. It was still full. He pulled over and popped the hood. Before he could even get out, a cold wind whipped through the trees, and the temperature dropped again. The engine stopped with a sputter, and Jake was left in eerie silence. From the darkness, he heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate. He turned around, and the figure was back, closer this time. The hollow eyes were even more intense, and the man's face was a grotesque mask of desperation. "Get out of here!" Jake shouted, slamming the hood down and scrambling back into the car. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The car roared back to life, but the headlights flickered and dimmed. Jake sped down the road, the map tossed aside. The forest seemed to close in on him, and the trees began to twist and writhe like living creatures. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, each bend revealing more of the same menacing darkness. His phone buzzed, finally a signal. He dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. Instead, he received a text: "You're not alone." His heart pounded as the message sank in. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man again, now joined by other shadowy figures. They were getting closer, and the whispers started, voices in the wind, chanting, pleading, and threatening. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jake swerved off the road, plowing through the underbrush. The car came to a jarring stop as it hit something solid, a wall, and he was thrown forward. Dazed, he looked around. The forest was gone, replaced by an empty, fog-covered field. The road had vanished. Jake stumbled out of the car, disoriented. The fog was thick, and visibility was almost zero. He heard the figures closing in, their footsteps echoing around him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar. In the midst of the chaos, Jake spotted something, a small, dilapidated cabin in the distance. Desperate, he ran towards it. The door creaked open with a shudder, and he stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind him. The cabin was dark and dusty, with old furniture covered in sheets. He could hear the figures outside, their voices now a cacophony of anger and despair. Jake searched the room, looking for anything that could help him. On a dusty shelf, he found an old journal. Flipping through it, he saw pages filled with drawings and writings about the lost highway, a place where people got lost and never returned. The last entry was chilling. Once you're here, you can't leave. A loud crash made him jump. The door shuddered under the impact of whatever was trying to get in. Jake grabbed a rusted fireplace poker, bracing himself. The door splintered, and shadowy figures began to seep through. In a last-ditch effort, Jake threw open a window and dove out into the fog. He ran blindly, the figures still hot on his heels. Just when he thought he couldn't run any further, he burst through the fog and found himself on a familiar stretch of road. His road, the one he started on. But as he looked around, it was clear he was alone. The lost highway was behind him, its horrors left in the fog. The night air felt different, thicker, more oppressive. Jake glanced back one last time, and the road was gone. In its place was an endless expanse of darkness. He didn't stop running until he reached the nearest town, where he collapsed in front of the first person he saw. He tried to explain what happened, but they just stared at him, bewildered. No one had ever heard of the lost highway. It was as if it had never existed. Jake left the town that morning, never to return. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when he's alone and the wind howls just right, he can still hear the whispers and feel the shadowy figures watching him, waiting for the day he'll be foolish enough to drive down the lost highway again. So there you have it, Jake's terrifying ordeal on the lost highway. Next time you hear about a spooky road or a haunted trail, maybe think twice before driving down it. Because once you're on the lost highway, escaping might be harder than you think. And remember, some roads are best left unexplored. The highway stretched before Lila, a dark ribbon slicing through the blackness of the night. The clock on her dashboard blinked 12:03 a.m., its green glow casting faint shadows across her face. She had been on the road for hours, driving from one small town to another, her mind buzzing with thoughts of the coming reunion with her sister. She wasn't fond of night driving, but delays earlier in the day had left her no choice. At least, she thought, the roads were empty. No honking horns, no brake lights flaring in irritation. Just her, the hum of her engine, and the faint metallic scent of rain on asphalt. Her fuel gauge hovered at half a tank, enough to get her where she was going. She sighed and tapped the radio, hoping for a distraction. Static greeted her on every station, the sound grating against her nerves. With a muttered curse, she turned it off, plunging the cabin into silence. That's when she saw it. A pair of headlights emerged in her rearview mirror, distant but gaining steadily. Lila glanced at her speedometer, 65 miles per hour, right on the limit. She kept her eyes on the road, but couldn't ignore the growing brightness behind her. The vehicle, a large black SUV, loomed closer. Its headlights were uncomfortably bright, making her squint as they reflected in her mirrors. Lila shifted in her seat, her pulse quickening. As the SUV closed the distance, it didn't pass her. Instead, it stayed directly behind, matching her speed. "That's weird," she muttered. Maybe the driver was distracted. Lila changed lanes, moving to the right to let the SUV pass. But it didn't. It followed her, moving into the same lane, still keeping the exact distance. Her chest tightened. Testing her suspicion, she switched lanes again, this time more abruptly. The SUV mirrored her. "Okay, what the hell?" Lila gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart beginning to race. She glanced at her phone on the passenger seat. No signal. Typical. She tapped the brakes lightly, hoping the SUV would pass. Instead, it slowed down, keeping the same maddening distance. Her breathing grew shallow. This wasn't a coincidence. The highway stretched on, empty save for her and the shadowy vehicle behind her. She pushed the gas pedal, her small sedan groaning as it crept past 70, then 75. The SUV kept pace effortlessly. A roadside sign flashed by in the glow of her headlights. Rest stop, 2 miles. Relief flooded her chest. If she could get to the rest stop, she might find safety. Other people, lights, anything but the suffocating emptiness of the road. She signaled and veered toward the upcoming exit. The SUV stayed with her. As the rest stop came into view, her stomach dropped. It was deserted. A single streetlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows over empty picnic tables and silent vending machines. Panic clawed at her throat. She didn't stop. Merging back onto the highway, she floored the gas pedal. The sedan surged forward, but the SUV remained glued to her tail. Then, it began to flash its high beams. The sudden bursts of light filled her cabin, disorienting her. She cursed, gripping the wheel tighter. "Leave me alone," she shouted, though no one could hear. The road ahead was a blur, her focus torn between the headlights in her rearview mirror and the oppressive darkness beyond her windshield. She didn't notice the subtle shift at first, the way the landscape seemed to repeat itself. Another sign appeared. "Rest stop, 2 miles. Lila frowned. That couldn't be right. She had just passed that sign. She glanced at her phone again. Still no signal. The SUV flashed its high beams again, a rhythmic pattern that almost seemed deliberate. On, off, on, off. It wasn't just following her, it was trying to communicate. But what did it want? Desperation gnawed at her. Up ahead, she saw an exit ramp with no sign, just an arrow pointing toward the left. It looked unfamiliar, but at this point she didn't care. She needed to get off the highway. The moment she veered onto the ramp, the SUV followed. The narrow road twisted and turned, plunging her into a dense forest. The trees pressed close, their branches clawing at the edges of the road like skeletal fingers. Lila's knuckles turned white as she gripped the wheel, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Suddenly, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. She screamed and swerved, the car skidding wildly before coming to a halt on the shoulder. Her heart pounded as she scanned the darkness. There was no one there. The SUV pulled up behind her, its headlights bathing her car in an unforgiving glow. She couldn't breathe. The driver's side door of the SUV opened, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood still for a moment, as if assessing her. Lila's instincts screamed at her to drive, but her body felt frozen. The man began to walk toward her, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "No," she whispered, fumbling for the gear shift. The figure stopped a few feet from her car, raising a hand. It wasn't a threatening gesture. It almost looked like a wave. "Are you okay?" his voice called out, deep and steady. Lila hesitated. Her window was rolled up, the glass between them offering a false sense of security. "I didn't mean to scare you," the man continued. "But you need to get off this road. Now." "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "This place," he trailed off, glancing around nervously. "It doesn't let people leave." Before Lila could respond, the man's face twisted in terror. He turned back to his SUV, shouting something she couldn't hear. And then the darkness moved. A shadow detached itself from the trees, impossibly large and amorphous. It surged toward the man, swallowing him in an instant. Lila screamed, slamming her foot on the gas. Her car lurched forward, tires screeching as she sped down the road. In her rearview mirror, the SUV's headlights flickered once, then vanished. She drove blindly, her mind racing. The road seemed endless, the trees pressing closer with each passing moment. Her headlights caught glimpses of movement, shapes darting between the trunks, too fast to identify. Another sign loomed ahead. "Rest stop, 2 miles. "No," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no." The sign was different this time. Beneath the words, scrawled in jagged red letters, was a chilling addition: "You can't escape." The subway car rattled and groaned as it sped through the city's underground tunnels, the fluorescent lights flickering in rhythmic bursts. Maya leaned against the window, her head resting on her hand, exhaustion seeping into her bones. It had been another grueling shift at the hospital, and her body ached for the solace of her bed. She glanced around the nearly empty train. A hunched elderly man sat at the far end, muttering to himself, his lips moving silently. A young couple occupied a row of seats near the middle, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. Maya's stop was just a few stations away, and she told herself she only needed to hold on a little longer. Her eyelids grew heavy as the train's rhythmic clatter worked like a lullaby, and before she realized it, her head had tilted back, and she drifted off. When she woke, the train was still, and the silence was absolute. Blinking away the haze of sleep, Maya sat upright. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window. The elderly man and the young couple were gone. She looked around, her pulse quickening. The train had stopped, but this wasn't her station. Outside the window was a platform bathed in dim, flickering light. The walls were cracked and stained with graffiti, and old posters hung in tatters, their slogans faded beyond recognition. Above the platform was a crooked metal sign that read, Station 66. Maya frowned. There was no Station 66 on her route. In fact, she'd never heard of such a station at all. She reached for her phone, but the screen displayed no signal. Before she could piece her thoughts together, a cold metallic voice crackled through the intercom. End of the line. All passengers must disembark. Maya hesitated. The train didn't look like it was going anywhere, and the oppressive silence pressed on her like a weight. When the doors hissed open, a rush of cold air swept into the car. It carried a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. There was no reply. Reluctantly, Maya stepped onto the platform, clutching the strap of her bag. The train doors closed behind her with an unsettling finality, and the train groaned as it began to move again. She turned quickly, watching as it disappeared into the dark tunnel, leaving her alone in the dim light. The platform was eerily quiet. No footsteps echoed, no trains rattled in the distance, no announcements played over the intercom. Only the faint buzz of the flickering lamps broke the silence. Her shoes clicked against the cracked tiles as she moved toward the edge of the platform. The tracks below were shrouded in darkness, the faint glint of the rails barely visible. Maya squinted, peering down the tunnel where the train had vanished. Something didn't feel right. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the darkness itself was alive. "Hello," she called out again, her voice trembling. A faint sound answered her. It was distant but unmistakable, a shuffle like feet dragging across stone. Maya froze. "Who's there?" The shuffling grew louder, closer, echoing through the tunnel. She took a step back, her heart pounding. Then she saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the platform. It was tall and gaunt, its body shrouded in darkness. The flickering lights above cast distorted shadows, making it difficult to make out its features. But one thing stood out, its eyes. They glowed faintly, two pinpricks of cold, unearthly light. "Stay back!" Maya shouted, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It moved closer, its steps jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Maya stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the platform. The figure stopped suddenly, tilting its head as if studying her. A low, guttural voice echoed through the station, though the figure's lips didn't move. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights above flickered violently, plunging the platform into total darkness. When the lights returned, the figure was gone. Maya's breath came in ragged gasps as she scanned the platform, her eyes darting to every shadow. The oppressive silence had returned, but the air felt colder, heavier. She turned toward the stairs at the end of the platform. If there was a way out, it had to be up there. Her footsteps echoed as she climbed, the sound unnervingly loud in the empty station. The stairwell was steep, the tiles cracked and slick with moisture. A single light bulb hung overhead, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen breeze. When she reached the top, Maya stopped dead in her tracks. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, dimly lit by a series of flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with old, rusted doors, each one numbered in faded paint. She glanced back down the stairs, but the platform was gone, replaced by more corridor. Panic set in. She walked quickly, then broke into a run, her breaths coming in sharp bursts. No matter how far she went, the corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the numbered doors blurring together. A loud bang echoed behind her, like metal striking stone. She whipped around, but the corridor was empty. Then she heard it, a low, rasping breath, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Maya bolted, her bag bouncing against her side. She didn't look back. Her legs burned, and her lungs ached, but she didn't stop until she reached the end of the corridor. There, a massive iron door loomed, its surface corroded with rust. She pushed against it, but it didn't budge. Her hands fumbled for a handle or a latch, but the door was solid, unyielding. The shuffling grew louder. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Let me out." The rasping breath was right behind her now. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the cold metal of the door. The figure stood just a few feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on her. This close, she could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. The skin was smooth, featureless, like a blank canvas. It raised a hand, long, spindly fingers reaching toward her. Maya screamed. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the train. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the familiar hum of the subway filled her ears. She was slumped in her seat, her bag resting on her lap. The elderly man and the young couple were gone, but outside the window, the familiar sight of her station greeted her. She stumbled off the train, her legs trembling. The platform was crowded with people, the bright lights a welcome relief after the oppressive darkness of Station 66. But as she walked toward the exit, a chill ran down her spine. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing on the edge of the platform. Tall, gaunt, glowing eyes. It watched her as the train doors closed. And then it was gone.
The shadows are restless tonight, and so are we. If you're brave enough, hit that like button. Let us know what you think in the comments. And subscribe for more spine-tingling stories that lurk just around the corner.